Now, the German lodges, the Asiatic Brethren, formed, I mentioned before, these were called the Lodges of the Golden and Rosy Cross. It was no longer just Rosicrucian, the Rosicrucian lodges. The Golden and Rosy Cross was a much higher development. It was a much more organized development after the Inquisition. These became esoteric lodges that incorporated into Rosicrucianism not only the things I've showed you in previous segments, but went even farther with these. Now, where did Gnosticism come from? Well, if we look in the Hellenistic period, there was a positive form of Gnosticism, which was Hermetic. It believed in a good cosmos. The cosmos is good and the divine potential of all souls. And there was a negative form of Gnosticism in the 1st, 2nd century that was ascetic, believed that the cosmos was evil and only the perfect could be redeemed. And the goal was to leave this world. In the medieval period, this form was translated through that into Europe, and so it was a negative form. And this came through through Akhmim in Upper Egypt, through the Arabs and the Hermetic synthesis. And that was carried forward into modern times in many different forms. It became science. That's where science came from, chemistry and things like that. And what was going on with the negative form of this is it became the Manichaeans and the Bogomiles and the Cathars of France, who believed in this negative world and classes of people and all this sort of thing. And they were subject to the Inquisition, and they were scattered far and wide. And then kind of remnants of that, because there weren't any real communities that could survive as communities, survived into the modern period. And they have now combined somewhat with the positive forms of Gnosticism. In fact, in the 21st century, the idea that males are higher souls than females and all the other Gnostic ideas really got changed. And so the old negative form is kind of merged with the positive form. And so we have Gnostic churches and integrated with Jungian psychology. However, there are still sects that preserve the old negative forms, the Mandeans, some Eastern sects. There's a fellow named Weor in South America who teaches people to be ascetic, etc., and there are certain other Western cults. So Gnosticism and the development of it I have a whole course on this with three different modules on Gnosticism, ancient and modern and so on, if you're interested in studying it. But this is basically where the Gnostic thing. Now, the Gnostic churches, the Gnostic ecclesiae, there were two successions of Gnostic churches. There were the French and the English, which came from the French. So it was only in France that the Gnostic church was able to re-emerge from the underground, its persecution. There was secret European ecclesiae. Ecclesiae means churches. And when we speak of Gnostic churches, we usually call them ecclesiae. During the period of the Inquisition, and it was part of the Hermetic Enlightenment, but most of these things had a positive form of Gnosticism that was related to alchemy and Rosicrucianism. And in France and Italy and Spain, where the Inquisition was the worst, there were still underground Gnostic communities or congregations. Many Catholic clergy were secret Gnostics. There was a special form of Valentinian Gnostic ecclesia, which were the more negative versions. And we can trace their lines of apostolic succession from Orsini di Gavina in 1724 to Fabre Palaprat and Maviel in 1800. The earlier lines are not written down because of the Inquisition, and that's what emerged. That line of succession was what actually emerged after the French Revolution. Fabre Palaprat came forward with his Gnostic ecclesiae and his lineage. So that is where the modern lineage of Gnostic churches that are apostolic, that have an apostolic lineage, trace their lineage. And we have lines of succession to the English Ecclesia Gnostica that were then passed down during the 19th century. And there are modern Gnostic churches now that have apostolic succession because they have not only the Gnostic succession, which is very hard to verify, but now because of the whole movement of the independent bishops and so on, they have a full apostolic succession associated with them. So in France and England and South America, and in North and South America. Now looking at another vector, this is a very important man. This is Max Theon. He's a Kabbalistic rabbi. And he was the founder of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, the HBL. He was the teacher, the Kabbalah teacher of Madame Blavatsky and of the woman who is known later as the mother, Mira Alfonsa, who was the life partner of Sri Aurobindo. And he was a brilliant man, and so was his wife, and he was teaching true Kabbalah, which is not just a bunch of diagrams and funny names and things like that. It's much more associated with a group activity, and I have his teachings. It took me years to get them, but I have them translated into English, and I've given them to people who are interested. They're the kind of things you have to read over and over for your whole life to really understand, because they're kind of like Heracles' utterances. They are sort of short, dark sayings. This is the symbol of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor, out of which Blavatsky and other people came, and the Theosophical movement developed in the 19th century. Now, there are many European influences in America. There was not only the radical Egyptian Freemasonry, but there was the Bavarian Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt. And there's all kinds of conspiracy theories about the Illuminati, but I assure you they are not true, since I'm a Grand Master of the Illuminati, and I can tell you that they don't exist and have any power and do diddly. So, but they developed in French and English Freemasonry, and they were the ones that were really the instigators of revolution in France and other kinds of places, and they also came to America. There were other influences like Mesmer in the post-revolutionary French Romanticism we talked about. There was a new anti-Puritan generation of people in upstate New York, sparked by a novel written by Nathaniel Hawthorne called The Scarlet Letter, which if you've read, you know what it's all about. It was a total rebellion against the idea that the Puritan ancestors were these great gods who established everything the way it should be, and that music was evil and art was evil, etc. The Romantic movement in the United States and the whole anti-puritanical movement, which became a Hermetic movement in the United States, was born there. So then there were utopian and religious communities that developed in this country. Some of them are very old, like the Amana community, which makes refrigerators and stuff. And socialist communities didn't seem to hang together very long, the political ones, but the religious communities did, like the Amish and so on. Quakers, Mennonites, and there were Catholic communities and Brethren. There were also political, socialist and liberationist and type of groups, but as I say, it was the religious ones that actually hung together. And there were frontier communities. And we've already talked about Johnny Appleseed and how he spread Swedenborgian thought every time he planted trees. He handed out Swedenborgian manuscripts and so on. And so the United States became a fertile ground for the planting of all kinds of esoteric ideas from Europe. Here are some of the major figures in American spiritualism. The Fox sisters, again in New York, started having raps and interpreting them, etc., and they founded a whole movement in seances and spiritism. And they eventually went on tour and did all kinds of things and started faking it, which is what happened to a lot of the early mediums and psychics. They actually were authentic, but then they had to perform and they couldn't do it. Horace Greeley was one of their great supporters. James Fenimore Cooper, W.C. Bryant, Governor Talmadge of Michigan, etc. It became a very big movement, Spiritism. And by the mid-century, we had spiritualist newspapers. Most of the citizens of Ohio were spiritualists. Brook Farm and other utopian communities that were practicing spiritualist and spiritist practices. And many, with the Civil War, many people had experiences, very personal experiences with people who had died untimely, brothers, fathers, sons, and things like this. And that made it very real to a lot of people who hadn't experienced that kind of thing before. I talked about Johnny Appleseed in the Western Frontier. Andrew Jackson Davis became one of the great spokesmen. He was called a Poughkeepsie seer. He became one of the great spokesmen for what was now called spiritualism. He wrote The Principles of Nature, Her Divine Revelations and Voice to Mankind. And Abraham Lincoln is alleged to have been very involved in spiritualism, although a lot of it was kept very secret. And there were many public figures. Allan Kardec popularized the idea of reincarnation and reincarnationalism, and was a very strong force in the development of spiritualism in this country. And then there were major churches that were founded in Brazil and other places in this hemisphere as a result of that. And so you find that there are parallel things in occultism and spiritualism that may have started in the United States or may have started in Europe that developed then in South America. Some American spiritualists, seance people at a seance table. We mentioned Andrew Jackson Davis, who looked like this when he was a young man and he started teaching spiritualism, and looked like this when he was an old man and started teaching and was still teaching it, and is considered to be a great sage. And this is Abraham Lincoln, who was quite a believer in spiritualism. Spiritualism was really the biggest spiritual force in the United States by the middle of the century. What about Mormonism? Well, Joseph Smith, who was the founder of Mormonism, had many connections to the European esoteric thought and European metaphorical esoteric and hermetic thought. And these are some of his early occult diagrams, and they bear great similarity to the style and genre of the European Hermetic and Rosicrucian diagrams. So I'm just showing them to you. These are some of the diagrams that he made. They look like Masonic, they look like European, they look like Hermetic diagrams. And as one of our people has mentioned, there are many of the old rites and rituals in Mormonism that go back to a much earlier form of Freemasonry and that preserves a lot of these traditions. So there was quite an esoteric and occult background to the development and the founding of Mormonism as well. People have written articles about this and done speculation about it. There was a movement called New Thought that brought about Christian Science. First was Phineas P. Quimby and what he called New Thought. And he developed the idea that the human mind and human spirit, taking off from Mesmer and some of his ideas, could control, and actually you could control your health and other things by using your mind. And his ideas came from transcendentalism and Calvinism and science, and he merged them all together. And also brought in a lot of the Hermetic and the European Magus traditions. And Mary Baker Eddy was a great student of his. And she was the one who founded Christian Science. She was a lady who was very unhealthy, and she used a lot of the principles that Phineas P. Quimby came up with, and then she applied them to other people and taught them to people. And this thing spread all over America, and the Christian Science Monitor was founded, and the Christian Science reading rooms, and Christian Scientism. And the whole business of healing by means of non-medical things. The main practice of medicine at that time was homeopathy. There wasn't modern medicine as we have today. There was not. Medicine was basically homeopathic, like not as it is today, and so these ideas fit along with a lot of those ideas quite well too. So we had this development in the 19th century of Christian Science, mind over matter, and so on. And that was the basis for the developing religion that became the religion of most of the U.S. legislators in Congress and Senate. They were Unitarians. They were not Trinitarians. And they went back to the deism of Thomas Jefferson, and their spirituality was based on the New Thought, spiritualism, and a lot of the same influences that came into Christian Science. Then there was sexual magic. I have to discuss this. This was an ancient magical technique. There was always a Hierophant and a high priestess in divine marriage, Hieros Gamos, and the mysteries. You still find them preserved in the tarot cards. There is also the whole business of sexual liberation and feminism that was an issue back as early as the Civil War and as early as the anti-slavery business. As a matter of fact, before the Civil War, there were many women's liberationists who wanted to make that the main issue rather than slavery, and people said, no, we have to do slavery first. So women's lib goes back a long time, but there was a lot of interest in it at that time. There was a fellow named Pascal Beverly Randolph. He was a photographer, and he developed what was called the Temple of Euless. And he was influenced by Europeans and Rosicrucians, and later the Golden Dawn was influenced by him. And then he influenced the Rosicrucians and other Europeans. And he was a member of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor. And his methods that he developed for sexual magic, which were magic that was done through male and female partner, which was a kind of a tantric kind of magic, a sort of degenerate tantra, were later picked up by Crowley, Uncle Al Crowley, and the OTO and other kinds of people that we'll be talking about in the next century. And Diane Fortune and other people. And her development of what's called astral sex, if you've ever read Diane Fortune. My teachers, one of her main teachers was Maud Lord Drake, who was a physical medium. And as a child in the early part of the 19th century, she experienced many manifestations, and people around her interpreted as acts of the devil. And she finally was having so many of these phenomena that she was ready to commit suicide, and she sat down by a lake and she was contemplating suicide. And a fellow came by, he was a medical doctor, and he was a spiritualist. And he saw that she was suicidal, and he went and talked to her. And he interpreted her phenomena to her. He told her, no, you're not, this isn't the devil. This is divine. This is God. This is good stuff. You have a great talent. So here at the age of 18 or something, when she was about ready to commit suicide because she'd had so many of these experiences, she was taken sort of taken under the wing of spiritualists and people, and she developed her talents. She became an internationally famous physical medium. Now, a physical medium is a person who produces manifestations. A guitar sits on the floor, it starts playing. Something manifests out of ectoplasm and things like this. This is a very high form of physical mediumship. Among the people that she gave readings to was Leland Stanford's wife, and she's gave her readings that got the wife to make the husband found Stanford University. And he was, of course, a real son of a bitch. He totally exploited the Chinese people he brought over to build his railroads, and he probably hired people to kill people and did all kinds of things. So I don't want to go too far into Stanford's business, but She was a very important person. Her name was Maud Lord, and then she married a man named Drake, and she became Maud Lord Drake. Uh, she died in a fire in Boulder Creek back here. She was Mother Jenny's teacher, and Mother Jenny was her student. I tell the story of it in my book about Mother Jenny called Mother Jenny's Garden. And before the fire, she told Mother that before any of this happened, she knew that it was going to happen, and there was no way that she could stop it. It was somehow it was going to manifest. Um, Mother Jenny nursed her before that, and she nursed her after she had been horribly burned until she died. Another big, probably one of the biggest important influences at the last part of the century was the development, of course, of Theosophy and what was called esoteric Buddhism through many people. Blavatsky is sort of the big name that goes with that, but there are many, many, many other people, Mabel Collins and so on. And anybody know who this is a picture of? That's Vivekananda. Vivekananda was a student, a very close student, a very advanced soul of Ramakrishna, Sri Ramakrishna. And he brought what we call the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna to the U.S. World's Fair in the late 19th century. And for the first time, the religion of Hinduism and the religions of the East were recognized as people could actually look at them as not inspired by the devil and see them as something entirely different. And he was very eloquent and lived in a house in New York that later became the home for the Societas Rosicrucianus in America or something like that. And he taught lots and lots of people. And because there was an immigration of Chinese to build railroads and other people from the Middle East, there we got a lot of Eastern religion coming in to this country, and it had a way of being understood by people who were spiritualists and theosophists and more advanced people. And Madame Blavatsky became a very important founder of the Theosophical movement, and her Tibetan masters, the idea that there were these really advanced people of this religion called Buddhism, and they were from Tibet, and they were her teachers, and they were far more advanced than things that the Catholics had and that sort of thing. So she was known affectionately as the Old Lady. This is Blavatsky. She was Russian. Her father was a Grand Master of a very esoteric order of Freemasons, and she had learned a lot from that. She was a person who had the spirit of adventure from the time she was very young and wanted to travel, and she traveled all over the world. She dressed as a man and was a member of the French Foreign Legion and fought and was wounded. She was an incredible person, and she finally made contact with these masters and was initiated in what today we would call the Tibetan Kali Chakra, but not the generation stages, but in the philosophical Kali Chakra and the cosmology. And she wrote very famous books in English, which were translated back into Russian by some of her great students in the 20th century, like Madame Roerich and so on. Here she is pictured with her supposed Tibetan masters, or her masters, Kutumi and Moria and so on. This is Franz Hartmann. He was one of her followers and associates and developers of the early theosophical movement in this country. Willa and I, and maybe some other people, maybe just you and I, are members of a theosophical group that was founded by the New York group down near, on the coast, near Arroyo Grande, which is near San Luis Obispo, as in the late 1890s by her secret section from New York, and they brought her chair there, some other things, and it's called the, I'm going to talk about that root in when we talk about the 20th century. It's called the Halcyon Theosophical Society, and the master who kind of rules over it is the master who worked with me, who is known as a Greek master, who Blavatsky knew until he left and disappeared, and his name is Hilarion.
And Hartman was a homeopath.
Yes, exactly.
A lot of books on Paracelsus.
Yeah, Hartman was a homeopath. The last part of the century created what we call the new episcopi vagantes, the wandering bishops, the independent bishops. Until this time, apostolic succession had been held by the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, not by any Protestant churches or anyone else, and jealously guarded. That means that it was a lineage directly from the Master Yeshua, Jesus, all the way down into modern times, from bishop to bishop. And that's known as apostolic succession. It's actually the longest continuous lineage in the world that we can document. So it was, however, held in clandestine lineages by, for example, a Knights Templar and certain underground Gnostic churches and things. Now, the Roman Church used what were called the Augustinian rules of succession, which means one bishop would make one bishop, and there were certain basic things that were necessary for it to do that. But there was no rules about what you had to believe or anything like that. You didn't have to be Orthodox or anything like that. You know. Only a bishop can ordain priests in the lower orders, and the consecration of a bishop was done in the context of a Eucharist or a Mass without coercion. And the Catholic Church made a canon law that required 3 bishops to make a new bishop. That was to protect against renegade heretical priests being made bishops. And so the episcopate was fairly locked into the Roman Church. It was also locked into the Eastern Orthodox Church, because Eastern Orthodoxy not only said that, but the bishops had to be unmarried and couldn't be married, and that they had to be Orthodox. And if any of their bishops started talking about ideas that were not Orthodox, were not part of the theology, the unchanged theology from the very early Eastern Orthodox Church from the 4th century, 5th century, then that person could be defrocked, he could be taken away. You can't do that in the Western Church. And Augustinian rules, once a bishop, always a bishop. Once a priest, always a priest, although the priest's license to operate can be yanked by a bishop. But a bishop's authority, he can be excommunicated by the church, but he's still a bishop. So in the latter 19th century, the valid apostolic successions were taken away from the Roman Church control by 3 Roman bishops, validly, legally, in Holland. And Dutch bishops are real tough to control. They're still today. They're real hard for the Catholic hierarchy to control. They consecrated Reverend Arnold Harris Matthews, who later changed his name to Matthew. And he consecrated Leadbeater, who founded the Theosophical Liberal Catholic Church, which broke entirely from Roman control, and soon Villat and other bishops were doing missionary work and organizing non-Roman churches. And that was the beginning of the wandering bishops, so to speak, the bishops that were independent. Now, there were lawsuits against these independent bishops that were placed by the Catholic Church and by the Anglican Church, and they were run through court in the 1930s, and by all the rules of the Catholic Church and all civil law and canon law, the right to valid apostolic succession was maintained by the courts. And so it's never been challenged. So in the Catholic Encyclopedia, you will hear that, well, these bishops are irregular, but they are valid. And so the episcopal, the monopoly on apostolic succession now has been taken out of those churches, and it has gone into funny places like theosophy. This established a basis for valid episcopal succession outside the Catholic and Orthodox churches, and made the 20th century Gnostic and esoteric churches. So here are some pictures of some of these things. This is the consecration of Bishop Harris, the very first renegade, I suppose you'd say. Here he is. He's now a bishop, and he's not under the control of the Catholic Church anymore. Here are some of the successions of another priest who was made a bishop, René Villat. He was consecrated by an independent Catholic church in Goa and in Ceylon, India, and he was given permission by Ignatius Peter III, who was a Jacobite patriarch of Antioch, to another bishop to be made into a bishop. And so he made a lot of valid bishops for immigrants in Canada and the U.S., because a lot of this happened because people were immigrating to the New World. They needed bishops, they needed priests from the Old World churches. So these people came over as missionary bishops, but they very quickly had a whole different mind than the Old World bishops had, and so they went way farther than the Old World bishops would go. So there was a Polish Catholic succession for immigrants in New York, and a Syrian Gallican and American Catholic, and a bunch of other kinds of things. And they commingled with the Matthews succession through the immigration of old Catholic bishops to this has created a new kind of apostolic form of Christianity. The liberal Catholic Church went to Hollywood in California and got a lot of support. Expanded all over the world. And Leadbeater, who was in Australia, his books on liturgy and Mass, which were magical, he talked about how the angels participated in things. It was a very esoteric stuff, a Mass was to him. And it was a reestablishment of the ancient Christian mysteries and so on. And unfortunately, the liberal Catholic Church has crystallized into an institution that really is not going to grow in the 21st century. Leadbeater was adamant about the unsuitability of women for ordination, so they just would not ordain women.
He got accused of and admitted to molesting a choir boys in his church.
I'm not aware of that.
Giant scandal about that.
Yeah,
And
probably.
his partner, another theosophist, that woman, feminist woman in England, Annie Besant.
Annie Besant, yeah.
Yeah, they put it together with that, during that time.
Yeah. Well,
It was a big scandal for him.
but there were a lot of false charges made. So as far as the truth of those charges, we don't really know.
I think he had to admit it, though. I read somewhere.
I would want to check that out before I would make a statement like that on here. In my book on them, I have put down the stuff that is true. I've also shown the refutation of some of the accusations that were made against some of these people, because there were some very nasty accusations made and they weren't true.
I bet. I called down to Ojai one time when I was ordering some books and tried to ask about it there, and they wouldn't tell me.
Well, they may not even know. So Leadbeater, this is Bishop Leadbeater in the liberal Catholic Church. He taught a lot in Australia, and the church spread to the U.S., United Kingdom. He wrote The Science of the Sacraments, which is worth reading if you're ever interested in esoteric Christianity. And he has a detailed Hermetic interpretation of Catholic doctrines like transubstantiation. And he talks about the change, that happens at the consecration when the bread becomes the host. And he has all kinds of theories about this. You can read this slide, and it's up on the internet. And this is his idea. These are his ideas about this. Theurgical interactions with angelic beings at the altar and so on. And he diagrams them in his book. And so this was very fascinating material for a lot of people. And so when you go to a liberal Catholic church and go through a Mass, then you've got a whole lot of Catholic ritual that's reinterpreted totally along Hermetic lines and theurgical lines. Right, yes. Yeah. But women cannot be priests. I went down and interviewed the new presiding bishop of the Liberal Catholic Church back in the 80s, and recorded it, the interview with him, and the old outgoing one. And I talked to them about, they both were very sympathetic to the idea that yes, women should be ordained, etc., but they just couldn't do it because their congregations were too conservative, etc. Well, the fellow who was in charge of the entire National Liberal Catholic Church seminary was a priest, and was a friend of mine. I went down and used to visit him a lot, he and his wife. And he was getting tireder and tireder of the stuckness, this crystallization in the church. He would have actually been in line probably for becoming the next presiding bishop of the Liberal Catholic Church, but he thought, and I was always encouraging to hang in until that happened. But it was Lawrence Williams. But finally, he just asked me to consecrate him as a bishop, an independent bishop, and I did at my home in another part of Watsonville. And he and his wife moved back east, where they still maintain a distance learning school, which they've done all their lives. That's how they make their income. And I don't think he's done an awful lot with his episcopate, but he just wanted out. He wanted out of the Liberal Catholic Church. And I have...
So did William Wise.
Yeah, and William Wise opted out. And I've rescued a few Liberal Catholic Church priests who were very highly qualified and made them bishops so they could operate independently, because that's what's happening. And there are still no women Liberal Catholic Church priests, even though there are even women priests in the Episcopal Church. And I left the Episcopal Church because of that issue. That's another whole thing. So here are his Australian students, Leadbeater with his Australian students. So the only picture I could find, and it's a gorgeous picture. Edgar Waite, he's responsible for a lot of the occult stuff that came through, the tarot decks and things like that. Here he is in his Masonic regalia. And most people that are introduced to tarot are introduced to Waite's deck of the tarot, which is wrong, has the wrong numbering of things. All that was perpetuated by the English and the Golden Dawn, who didn't really understand correctly how the cards should be attributed. We can go again to Christine Payne-Towler for that. C.C. Zion, that's named after a Hebrew letter. This gentleman was a member of the Hermetic Order of Luxor, and he was an American, and he established some very important things in America. The Brotherhood of Light, the Hermetic Brotherhood of Light, the Church of Light. This is some of his old pamphlets from the 19th century. But it was out of his work that a great deal of interest in astrology developed, in Western astrology. And you can still find the Brotherhood of Light lessons and so on. This is...
They advertise on Mountain Astrology.
Yeah.
They're all updated now.
Yeah.
They're all
Golden Dawn, you probably should understand now how those letters are arranged in order to make sigils and things, because I showed you that in another segment. The Golden Dawn was an attempt to bring together the most esoteric knowledge, especially in theurgical knowledge and geomantic knowledge and astrological knowledge and Kabbalistic knowledge and alchemical knowledge, into a magical order, an English magical order, by two people, one of whom was a mortician, or a person who worked as a coroner, and he was a very brilliant man, and another person who named Mathers, who worked with him, who was not as grounded as this other gentleman. This is Mathers. He was one of the two co-founders of the Golden Dawn. This is his partner, Wynne Westcott, who was a pretty sharp guy. The two of them rescued all kinds of documents, including Dr. Dee's diaries and his experiments that we talked about with Dr. D back in the 17th century, with Kelly and his interactions with angels, and Mathers later developed that into the Enochian language and all this sort of thing, which there's two forms of Golden Dawn now, the non-Enochian and the Enochian. And they basically go after two forms that follow these two men. Mathers eventually developed a form of the Golden Dawn that and was enamored with Al Crowley, Uncle Al as he's called, who founded the OTO and who was an absolutely brilliant but foolish man. Westcott eventually parted company with Mathers, and they dissolved the Golden Dawn, and there are now Golden Dawn knockoffs, so they've come up, but they don't have a really legitimate charter back to the original Golden Dawn, over the issue of Crowley. And Crowley was a very big, major issue, but that's really a 20th century issue. This is Yeats, the poet. He was a member of the Golden Dawn. There were many people that were members at that time. This is Theodore Royce, who was a founder of some important things that I've inherited charters from. This is Kellner, who is also a founder of Rosicrucian and other orders that I've inherited charters from. And this is Cromheller, again, the same thing. They were all members of these of the Golden Dawn. This is Uncle Al, Aleister Crowley.
Wow.
Boy. And there are many stories I could tell you about him, and there are many people that just worship him and think he's the most brilliant human being who ever
You'd have
lived.
to look hard to find that.
Well, that's the only one I could find online.
10,000 years.
Yeah. But there were women. For example, Dion Fortune and many other women, very brilliant women, who were members of this order as well. We've come pretty much to the end of the 19th century. I'm not going to tell you a lot more about the Golden Dawn. There's many books you can read about it if you want to. In our final module, it's very connected with what we're doing. It all goes up and flows very easily. Basically, there's a lot of international communion, and what had become separate English and French and things gets kind of merged together. The Western mystery tradition gets integrated with science and technology, and European schools come into the American melting pot, and you get sort of racial, gender, and social liberalization and democratization that accelerates things, and we get human beings who are very different than 19th century human beings, who are in need of other kinds of things. And we have a more advanced kind of human soul that reaches out to many different areas of the world. So we really have a theosophical world kind of spirituality that's developing in the 20th century, and that's what we'll look at next time.